Okay, let's unpack this. We spend so much time talking about prejudice and bias as these massive systemic social problems, right? Issues rooted in history, power structures, institutions, and that's absolutely crucial work, no doubt. But today, we're zooming right into the individual mind. We're doing a deep dive specifically on the psychological ingredients, the things that make one person more or less susceptible to holding prejudice in the first place.
Exactly. If you think about the systems providing the structure for bias, then it's the individual mind that really provides the fuel.
Oh,
So,
sure.
yeah, we're looking at the foundational psychological architecture,
Mhm.
how our deeply held personal beliefs, the social ideologies we subscribe to, maybe without even realizing it sometimes, and the immediate emotional triggers we experience,
Yeah.
how these all interact, and how they ultimately either solidify bias or, and this is critical, maybe inhibit it entirely.
Right. And the blueprint for this deep dive, we've structured it very clearly, specifically aiming for those aha moments, but hopefully without that feeling of information overload. We're essentially covering three big categories that kept coming up across all the source material. Personal values first, then social ideologies, and finally, the immediate impact of emotion. Our goal really is to synthesize how these internal components structure your entire worldview and how those structures, in turn, either foster deep tolerance or, well, create some pretty visceral, intractable conflict.
And we absolutely have to start with values. I mean, they really are the bedrock here. In this context, values are the core beliefs people hold about what's important, the importance of their goals, the desired outcomes they strive for, or maybe try to avoid in life. And here's the central tension, the thing we have to address right away. Some values just seem inherently structured to, let's say, facilitate prejudice, while others seem to actively inhibit it. Prejudice fundamentally seems to arise less out of simple dislike and more out of this perception that an outgroup holds values that are just incompatible with the ingroup's values.
Okay, so before we even get into specific belief systems or ideologies, we need to understand this foundational level. What specific values are really governing whether we see others as, I guess, psychological allies or potential existential threats?
Okay, so let's start with the first big set of conflicting values. The sources really frame these as structuring almost all modern worldviews: individualism and egalitarianism. Now, these are huge concepts, obviously. How do we narrow their focus down specifically to how they relate to uh, the root causes of prejudice? Yeah, good question. We narrow down by looking at how they influence judgment and attribution. So individualism first. This is the value that emphasizes, self-reliance, independence, the idea that personal success is earned entirely through one's own efforts, hard work pays off, that sort of thing. And critically, the research directly connects this value to something called the Protestant work ethic,
Ah,
which basically dictates that hard work, maybe frugality, self-discipline, these are the morally correct paths to success in life. It's not just practical, it's moral.
right. And I can immediately see the consequence of that connection. If I hold individualism as a really high value and I see a group that maybe appears to be struggling or, say, receiving social assistance, my moral judgment could be instantaneous, couldn't it?
It often is, yeah.
Yeah.
And it becomes a really powerful engine for exclusion. So groups that are stereotyped, rightly or wrongly, as violating these core principles of self-reliance and hard work, maybe they're perceived as lazy or overly dependent or just unwilling to contribute, they tend to be viewed negatively by those who highly endorse individualism. That value system essentially sets up this powerful internal moral justification for, say, withholding resources or expressing bias. Because you're no longer just judging a person's situation, you feel like you're judging a perceived moral failing.
I see. And the counterpoint then, egalitarianism, seems like it functions almost as the psychological counterweight to that system.
It really does. Egalitarianism is sort of the opposing force. It's built on principles like equal opportunity, equal treatment for all people, and importantly, a genuine, robust concern for the welfare of others, particularly those who might be marginalized or disadvantaged. And the research here is incredibly consistent and honestly, quite encouraging. The greater an individual's endorsement of egalitarian values, the less prejudice they tend to show pretty much across the board.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense. If your core value system really prioritizes concern for others' well-being and equal treatment, it forces you to pause, doesn't it? It acts like a sort of built-in psychological guardrail, kind of inhibiting that immediate activation of negative stereotypes, because those stereotypes would conflict directly with your core moral mission, which is ensuring fairness.
Precisely. It short-circuits that immediate judgmental leap. Hashtag tag 1.2, the value difference hypothesis in causal models.
So, this inherent tension between these core values, individualism versus egalitarianism, brings us neatly to the core concept for this section, the value difference hypothesis. It suggests, like you said earlier, that it moves beyond just simple dislike, that something deeper is really at play here.
Yeah, the value difference hypothesis basically proposes that prejudice is fundamentally rooted in this perception again. Perception is key that an outgroup's value system differs significantly, and perhaps even dangerously, from one's own. The conflict isn't necessarily based on, physical traits or language. It's based on a perceived moral or structural code being alien or maybe even threatening to the in-group's way of life.
Okay, so the perception of value difference is the trigger. Got it. But how does that perception actually transform into measurable prejudice? The sources seem to provide two major theoretical explanations here. The first one is called the attribution value model.
Right, the attribution value model details the necessary steps, kind of like a recipe, for prejudice to activate. It suggests that this process starts when we perceive that a minority group possesses characteristics that are somehow contrary to the majority group's cherished values. But, and this is the really critical distinction we have, to make prejudice only truly results if the group is also perceived to be responsible for those negative characteristics.
Wait, okay, I need to pause there because that prerequisite, the assignment of responsibility, that seems like where the bias becomes truly powerful, right? Like if I see a group suffering from, say, high unemployment, but I attribute that unemployment to systemic barriers or maybe a lack of opportunity in their area, my response might be pity or maybe support or wanting to change the system.
Precisely. If you don't assign internal responsibility, if you don't blame the group itself, the prejudice trigger kind of remains dormant. The mechanism requires that cognitive leap. So if
Uh-huh.
you hold the value of individualism very strongly and you see an unemployed group, you must first attribute their situation internally, maybe saying they're lazy or unwilling to try, which violates your core value. And you must hold them responsible for that perceived laziness. Only then, according to this model, is the prejudice fully activated and, crucially, justified by your belief system.
Wow. So it literally transforms potential pity into active contempt.
It really can, yeah. And the research suggests this model, while it's pretty robust, tends to work best for groups defined socially rather than biologically. Groups where membership is theoretically seen as a choice, like maybe political affiliation or certain lifestyle groups.
Mhm.
Or it applies well where groups are perceived to be highly homogenous, very similar internally, like certain professional or cultural subgroups.
Why those specific types of groups?
Well, because in those cases, knowing the group membership seems to provide highly specific, maybe useful information in the mind of the perceiver. It makes that value judgment and the subsequent attribution of responsibility feel more immediate and powerful. Like, oh, they're that kind of person, so of course they act that way.
Yeah.
Hashtag tag tag 1.3, existential fear and terror management theory, TMT.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me because we move from these perceived moral failings or value differences to something much deeper, maybe the most fundamental existential fear we all share. Let's talk about terror management theory or TMT.
Right, TMT. It's rooted in this really brutal biological conflict. We have this powerful innate human instinct for self-preservation, right? We want to live. But that crashes directly with the profound, maybe uniquely human knowledge that our own death is absolutely inevitable. And that realization, the coexistence of wanting to live forever and knowing we won't, creates this intense underlying psychological terror. Since we can't physically eliminate death, obviously, we manage this terror, we cope. And the primary way we do that is by constructing and clinging fiercely to cultural worldviews.
So our cultural worldview, maybe our national identity, our religion, our moral code, our political ideology, it's effectively our psychological shield against the abyss, against that terror.
Mhm.
It promises us kind of immortality, doesn't it? Whether that's literal, like heaven, or reincarnation via religion, or maybe symbolic, like leaving a legacy, contributing to a great nation, upholding a culture that will outlive us.
That's precisely its core function, according to TMT. It's a mechanism for meaning, for feeling like life isn't just finite and random. But what happens when that shield is attacked? Or maybe just questioned? What happens when an outgroup presents a completely viable, alternative way of living, a different path to meaning? When our worldview is threatened, we become overwhelmingly motivated to defend it. And one of the most psychologically efficient ways to defend our way of life is by, well, derogating the challenging outgroup, pushing them down.
Because they become living, breathing evidence that our path, our chosen path to meaning and immortality, isn't the only true way, or maybe isn't even the best way. And that's a direct threat to our internal security, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. Their very existence, especially if they operate on radically different values, can feel like it implicitly invalidates the promise of our own cultural script. So they must be diminished, stereotyped, or pushed away somehow to maintain the psychological coherence of our shield, to keep that terror at bay.
The sources talk about the research method used to test TMT, which involves something called mortality salience. How do researchers actually, activate this death anxiety in a controlled experimental setting?
It's often quite straightforward, actually.
Hmm.
They activate mortality salience typically by asking participants to do something like write a brief paragraph about what they think will physically happen when they die, just contemplating the physical process. Or sometimes they show them short, maybe emotionally evocative video clips about death or dying. And when mortality is made salient, when death is on the mind, the findings are remarkably consistent across many studies. Participants almost immediately derogate outgroups more harshly. They also identify more strongly with their own ingroups, kind of pulling together for safety. And this is the really counterintuitive piece that requires a bit more thought.
Yeah.
They actually tend to prefer outgroup members who adhere to the negative ingroup stereotypes about them.
Whoa, hang on. That's the part that definitely catches you off guard. We're saying that when people are reminded of their own death, they actually prefer a negative stereotype about another group to be proven true. That seems incredibly counterproductive for, social harmony.
It absolutely is counterproductive for harmony, yes,
Right.
but it's highly productive for psychological defense.
Yeah.
Think about it. Viewing the outgroup in rigid, stereotypic terms actually reinforces the in-group's worldview, especially if the stereotype implies some kind of weakness or moral failure on the part of the outgroup. If the stereotype is negative, let's say, that the outgroup is chaotic or maybe immoral, and then you encounter a member of that group who seems to embody that stereotype, it feels like it validates the idea that the outgroup's challenge to the in-group's structured moral values is invalid. It's like, see, they really are like that.
Start there.
This strengthens the in-group's cultural shield, confirming that they are on the right path to meaning and symbolic immortality.
Okay, so TMT is suggesting that a significant portion of prejudice isn't necessarily based on conscious hatred or dislike, but maybe on this deeply primal, self-serving need for meaning and security in the face of our own mortality.
That's really the core insight, yes. Prejudice can function as a defense mechanism against death anxiety. But, and this is important, the research also provides a kind of caveat, maybe an escape clause, if you will. Mortality salience doesn't always have to lead to prejudice.
Okay, so how do you interrupt that mechanism? Once that death anxiety is triggered, how can you stop the automatic derogation?
Well, you can interrupt it by reinforcing the anti-bias aspects within the culture itself. So if researchers prime people before activating mortality salience, maybe by reminding them of cultural values that explicitly promote intergroup tolerance, respect, or fairness, it can actually offset that defensive derogation process. It shows that tolerance and respect can themselves be framed as core, protected components of the shared cultural worldview, just as important as any other value. They become part of the shield, too.
Okay, moving on from those sort of foundational psychological fears, let's shift to religion. Religion is perhaps the most visible, most explicit repository of cultural values, and often the promise of literal immortality that TMT just talked about. But the sources point out that the relationship between religion and prejudice is really complex, often quite paradoxical. Why is this relationship so tricky to pin down?
It is complex, largely because religion often contains these inherent structural contradictions regarding tolerance.
Right.
Most major religions preach universal love, acceptance, compassion. But at the same time, they also delineate a usually quite strict moral code defining right and wrong, insiders and outsiders. So this means some aspects of religious belief seem to facilitate prejudice, while other aspects actively inhibit it. It pulls in both directions. The key factor that researchers use to untangle this is differentiating between what they call proscribed prejudices and permitted prejudices.
Okay, let's define that difference clearly because it sounds absolutely essential for understanding the data that follows.
Yeah, definitely. So prescribed prejudices are those attitudes or biases that are explicitly forbidden by the religion's core teachings. These usually relate to general intergroup tolerance, love thy neighbor, judge not, universal acceptance kind of ideas. Permitted prejudices, on the other hand, are those directed toward groups perceived to violate the religion's core moral or spiritual values. Think about groups perceived as non-traditional, maybe sinful or threatening to the established religious order.
Okay, so when researchers simply measure general religious involvement, things like how often someone prays, attends services, or just how religious they consider themselves to be, what does the data actually tell us about these two different types of prejudice, prescribed versus permitted?
It tells a very nuanced story, actually. General self-rated religious involvement is largely uncorrelated with prescribed prejudices.
Meaning more religious people aren't necessarily more likely to reject general tolerance.
Exactly. Most people, religious or not, tend to agree that general tolerance is a good thing, at least on paper. So that measure doesn't show much difference. However, this same measure of general religious involvement shows a moderate positive correlation with permitted prejudices.
Ah, so more religious involvement is linked to more prejudice against groups seen as violating religious values.
Yes, prejudice directed specifically toward groups perceived to challenge the religious value system. It suggests the commitment isn't always to universal love, but maybe to love that's conditional on sharing a certain moral framework. Hashtag 2.2 religious orientation and fundamentalism.
Okay, so that suggests that simply being religious isn't the key factor here. It's more about how someone practices or relates to their religion, their orientation, that matters more. The sources distinguish between what they call intrinsic and extrinsic religious orientation. Can you break those down?
Sure. An intrinsic orientation describes someone who has genuinely internalized the religion's teachings. They truly believe and try to live by them as an end in itself. For them, religion is about seeking meaning, connection, guidance through faith itself. An extrinsic orientation, however, is different. It describes people who are using religion more as a tool, a means to an end, for achieving non-religious goals. Things like gaining social contacts, securing acceptance in the community, maybe achieving status, or even finding self-justification for pre-existing biases or behaviors. Religion serves a social or psychological function beyond pure faith.
Right. And the data presumably shows that these distinct psychological drivers lead to different outcomes when it comes to prejudice.
Absolutely, it maps quite clearly. Intrinsically religious people, those who've truly internalized the teaching, show a very small negative correlation with prescribed prejudices.
So slightly more generally tolerant.
Slightly, yes. Their genuine faith seems to make them a little more inclined towards general acceptance, but they still maintain a moderate correlation with permitted prejudices. Their conviction might shield them from some general bias, but it seems to focus their potential intolerance specifically on those perceived moral threats to their deeply held values.
Okay. And what about the extrinsically religious person? The one using religion more as a social shield or tool?
They show a small positive correlation with prescribed prejudices.
Meaning slightly more prejudiced in general?
Yes, slightly more prejudice in terms of general acceptance. And they also show a very small positive correlation with permitted prejudices. Essentially, they seem slightly more prejudiced across the board, but maybe less intensely focused on specific moral violator groups compared to the intrinsically religious. It suggests that, for them perhaps, religious participation is driven more by maintaining in-group boundaries, social security, conformity, rather than deep spiritual conviction. This might make them generally more defensive toward almost any outgroup.
And then we have religious fundamentalism, which the sources treat as a separate, perhaps more rigid category. How is that defined?
Religious fundamentalism is generally defined as this absolute, rigid belief that there is one specific set of religious teachings that contains fundamental, inerrant, unchanging truths about humanity, deity, and the universe. It's a very black and white worldview, inherently exclusionary because it posits only one correct path. And when measured, fundamentalism shows a small positive correlation with prescribed prejudices. So, a bit more general intolerance again, but a substantially larger and more specific correlation with permitted prejudices.
So fundamentalism is the clearest indicator of that targeted bias based on perceived moral violation.
It seems to be, yes. The belief in one inerrant truth makes deviation seem particularly threatening and unacceptable.
Okay, so when we try to synthesize all this complex data on religion and prejudice, what's the main takeaway for someone trying to understand this? What's the aha moment here?
Well, the overarching conclusion really is that the paradox is real. It's not simple. While almost all religions do teach general acceptance and tolerance in some form, this acceptance is often, in practice, immediately limited to people perceived to share the same core religious values. Prejudice is thus permitted, even implicitly encouraged sometimes, against people who are perceived to violate those values or threaten the perceived inerrant truth of the faith. And the crucial note, which we absolutely have to keep reiterating whenever we discuss this kind of research, is that all this data is correlational. We cannot definitively conclude from this that religion causes prejudice.
Right. It could be the other way around, or a third factor.
Exactly. It's perhaps more likely that religion provides a powerful, ready-made, and often socially sanctioned framework for expressing pre-existing prejudices that are actually rooted in those deeper value conflicts we talked about earlier. It gives justification.
Okay, so if individual values are like the raw materials for our beliefs, then social ideologies seem to be the elaborate, more rigid world structures that we build on top of those values. They're essentially comprehensive belief systems that really guide how we see and react to the world, aren't they?
That's a great way to put it, yeah. Social ideologies are incredibly powerful precisely because they satisfy some very deep psychological needs. They are these comprehensive sets of attitudes and beliefs that predispose people to view the world and respond to complex social events in highly consistent, often predictable ways. They provide conviction, a sense of purpose, and perhaps most importantly, a coherent structure for navigating what can feel like a very complex, confusing, and sometimes frightening social environment. They simplify things. Tag 3.2 right-wing authoritarianism, RWA.
Now, the sources focus heavily on two major ideologies that are consistently linked in the research to individual prejudice: right-wing authoritarianism, or RWA, and social dominance orientation, SDO. Let's start with RWA. It wasn't always seen this way, right? It was initially thought of more as a personality trait.
That's right. Early research looked at an authoritarian personality, but it's been reconceptualized more as RWA, which is seen as comprising three interconnected attitudes or tendencies. First, there's authoritarian submission, basically, a high degree of submission and deference to established, legitimate in-group authority figures, respecting the hierarchy. Second, authoritarian aggression, general aggressiveness, often morally outraged, directed toward various outgroups or individuals who are perceived as targets, condemned by those authority figures. And third, conventionalism, a very rigid adherence to traditional social norms, values, and beliefs, and a strong rejection of anything perceived as deviant.
Let's ground that conventionalism component a bit more. In a practical conversational context, what happens when someone high in RWA sees a deviation from tradition, say, something challenging traditional family structures or gender roles?
That's exactly where the threat response really kicks in hard for them. If a high RWA person sees a deviation from what they consider the traditional definition of family, or traditional moral codes regarding behavior, success, or social roles, they tend to perceive that deviation not as just mere difference or social evolution, but as a dangerous erosion of the moral fiber that holds society together. They tend to seek order, stability, and safety above almost all else, often holding an underlying belief that the world is inherently dangerous and may be spiraling into chaos if traditions aren't upheld.
And what are the general cognitive tendencies or personality characteristics that often accompany someone high in RWA?
Well, the research suggests several tendencies that seem to predispose them towards prejudice. This often includes a degree of mental inflexibility, maybe a lower openness to experience, a general disinterest in new or challenging ideas, and crucially, as I mentioned, a worldview that perceives the external environment, particularly social change, as highly dangerous and threatening. Because they see danger and potential chaos everywhere, they feel this deep need for a rigid, simplified organization of the world into clear, predictable ingroups and potentially threatening outgroups.
And the sources really highlight the essential role of authority figures in this whole RWA structure. It's not just prejudice against difference in general, it's prejudice that's specifically sanctioned or directed by power, right?
That is absolutely the linchpin of RWA. High RWA individuals tend to accept prejudice against groups condemned by authority figures as legitimate, even necessary, because that authority promises to restore order, maintain security, fight the perceived chaos. They seek security primarily through conformity and obedience to those authorities. So an RWA individual might not naturally be prejudiced against a particular outgroup on their own, but once that group is identified as a threat or as deviant by the established political, religious, or social power structure, once the threat is defined by authority, the RWA individual is much more likely to accept the ensuing aggression or discrimination as necessary to maintain social order. This helps explain why RWA is correlated with prejudice against such a wide variety of different groups over time. The specific definition of threat is often dictated by whoever is perceived to be in legitimate authority at that moment. Tag 3.3 social dominance orientation, SDO.
Okay, now let's turn to the other major ideology, social dominance orientation, or SDO. This sounds fundamentally different from RWA. While RWA seems rooted in fear, conformity, and the need for security, SDO seems rooted more in the drive for status, power, and hierarchy itself. Is that fair?
That's a very fair distinction, yes. SDO is driven by this core desire for one's own in-group to dominate and be superior to outgroups. It's fundamentally about wanting stratification, a clear social hierarchy, not necessarily just safety from chaos. It has two measurable components, according to the research. First, group-based dominance. This is the clear belief that one's own group ought to be at the top of the social ladder, that it deserves its superior position. And second, opposition to equality. This is the explicit belief that groups currently relegated to the bottom of the hierarchy should probably stay there. Efforts to promote equality are seen as disruptive or unnatural.
So, if RWA is maybe the psychological mindset of the concerned citizen seeking rigid adherence to rules for safety, SDO sounds more like the mindset of someone wanting to maintain or climb the established social or corporate ladder and keep others below them.
That's actually an excellent analogy. High SDO scorers don't just prefer safety, they actively prefer unequal societies where their group holds the superior position. And the data confirms this quite clearly. Members of groups that already hold greater societal power, whether that's economic, political, or social power, typically exhibit higher average levels of SDO. Makes sense, right? They have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo that benefits them. Their specific prejudice trigger is also different from RWA. They tend to be most prejudiced against members of groups that challenge the legitimacy of the existing inequality. Anyone seeking to flatten the hierarchy, demanding more resources or status, is perceived as a direct threat to their group's position.
And what are the general psychological characteristics or traits that tend to accompany high SDO?
They tend to see the world as a highly competitive, almost zero-sum game. For my group to win, another group must lose. They are often quick to classify people into in-groups and out-groups based on status. Some research describes them as potentially more manipulative in interpersonal relations, focused on achieving dominance. And a really key finding is that they consistently score very low in empathy, particularly toward members of lower status groups. Because they view society fundamentally as a ladder, they often see those below them as somehow deserving of their lower position, and those seeking to climb as unwelcome competitors.
This desire to maintain superiority and the belief that it's justified leads them directly to using that cognitive tool we touched on earlier, legitimizing myths. Can you remind us what those are?
Yes, legitimizing myths are absolutely essential for SDO to function smoothly. They are basically sets of widely accepted attitudes, beliefs, stereotypes, and even ideologies that high SDO individuals and societies use to rationalize and justify their group's dominant position and the existing social hierarchy. Without these myths providing a good reason for the inequality, the dominance would be much harder to sustain morally and socially. It would just look like naked oppression.
Okay, can you give us a concrete example of how a legitimizing myth might function in practice to actually justify inequality?
Sure. Let's consider the distribution of public resources again. Maybe something like funding for schools in different neighborhoods. If a lower status outgroup is widely stereotyped, perhaps through media portrayals or historical biases as being inherently less intelligent or maybe less motivated or more prone to crime, high SDO individuals can seize on this stereotype. It becomes the legitimizing myth. They then use this stereotype, this myth, to argue that investing heavily in quality education or social programs for that group would be a waste of resources because the group is naturally incapable of benefiting from it or wouldn't use it properly. See how the myth doesn't just describe the group in a biased way. It actively functions to justify denying them the very resources that might allow them to challenge the existing hierarchy and improve their standing. It makes the unequal distribution seem logical, perhaps even inevitable, and fair based on the group's inherent characteristics.
Okay, this feels like a perfect point to pause and really synthesize the core distinction between these two dominant ideological structures, RWA and SDO. They sound like they often lead to similar outcomes, prejudice, discrimination, but their underlying motivations seem quite different. But are they ever really completely separate? I mean, doesn't the desire for dominance, SDO, often require submission to some kind of authority, RWA, to enforce that dominance effectively? Where do the sources draw the line? Is it a clean break?
That's a really insightful question. The sources are clear that while RWA and SDO often correlate in individuals, people high in one are often somewhat high in the other. They are indeed driven by fundamentally different core psychological needs and motivations. SDO focuses almost purely on dominance over outgroups and managing intergroup relations to maintain hierarchy. Its primary goal is eliminating competition for resources and status, keeping the latter firmly in place with their group on top. It's about group competition. RWA, conversely, focuses primarily on submission to in-group authority figures and seeking personal and group security against perceived external threats, chaos, and social decay. Its primary goal is safety through conformity, obedience, and order. It's about group cohesion and security.
Okay, so let me try to recap that simply. RWA seeks security through rigid conformity and deference to authority. SDO seeks superiority through enforced hierarchy and competition. One is fundamentally fear-based, the other is more ambition or dominance-based.
That's a very good summary. They represent two different psychological paths that, yes, frequently lead to the same prejudicial outcomes, but they get there through distinct mechanisms and are triggered by different kinds of perceived threats. RWA fears chaos and deviance. SDO fears equality in competitors.
All right, we have to now address the relationship between political orientation and prejudice. This is obviously a very politically charged area, so we need to tread carefully. The research, as presented in the sources, consistently reports correlations between holding conservative political beliefs and higher average levels of prejudice against various groups. Now, as we proceed here, it's absolutely crucial that we maintain strict impartiality. Our job is simply to report these psychological findings exactly as they appear in the data without endorsing or condemning any political viewpoint whatsoever. We're looking at the psychology, not the politics itself.
Yes, that impartiality is essential, and thank you for stating it clearly. The research does consistently show these correlations. That's quite well established in the literature cited. However, the explanation for why those correlations exist is much more complex, and it actually cycles right back to the two ideologies we just discussed, RWA and SDO. The sources reveal something really interesting. When researchers statistically control for the influence of RWA and SDO meaning, they mathematically account for the overlap between conservatism and the desire for security, RWA, and the desire for dominance, SDO. Then political orientation itself seems to have very little independent relationship to prejudice.
Wow, okay, that's a massive insight, potentially. It means the political label itself, conservative in this case, might be largely inert when it comes to directly causing prejudice once you account for these underlying ideological motivations. So what is the conservative belief system doing in this equation then, according to the research?
Well, the interpretation suggested by the data is that conservatism likely does not directly cause prejudice in most cases. Rather, it seems far more likely that people who are already prone to prejudice, perhaps because they are naturally higher in RWA or SDO tendencies, find that the conservative belief system provides a highly coherent, socially acceptable, and politically powerful structure. A structure they can use to justify and rationalize their pre-existing prejudices. The ideology essentially serves as a powerful rationalization tool, a legitimizing myth on a grand scale that validates their desire for social hierarchy or their need for conformity and traditional order. Hashtag tag 4.2, the role of values in attribution.
And this also seems to show the continuing powerful influence of those core values we started with back in part one, individualism and egalitarianism.
Absolutely. The connection is very clear in the data. On average, the research shows that self-identified conservatives, as a group, tend to place significantly more weight on the value of individualism, self-reliance, personal responsibility, and less weight on the value of egalitarianism, equality, social welfare, compared to self-identified liberals. This average value difference is key, because when we look within the conservative group, we find that political conservatives who happen to score high in egalitarianism actually score substantially lower on measures of prejudice than conservatives who are low on egalitarianism. This really reinforces the idea that the underlying value differences, not the political label itself, are the more critical factor driving the prejudice correlations.
And that attribution value model we discussed also comes right back to center stage here, doesn't it? The whole idea of assigning responsibility for negative outcomes.
That's exactly right. The research consistently shows that, again, on average, political conservatives are statistically more likely than liberals to attribute negative outcomes to internal factors within the individual or group. For example, they are more likely to conclude that unemployed people are perhaps lazy or lack initiative, or that those in poverty are primarily making poor life choices, rather than attributing these outcomes to systemic factors like discrimination or lack of opportunity. This tendency toward internal attribution makes them, statistically speaking, far more likely to perceive others as violating important values, like hard work and self-reliance, which, as the model predicts, directly facilitates higher average levels of prejudice. Hashtag tag 4.3 bipartisan prejudice.
Now, for a long time, a lot of the research in this area focused heavily on this prejudice gap, primarily highlighting the higher average scores found among conservatives on many measures. But the sources we looked at make it clear that prejudice is definitely not exclusive to one side of the political spectrum. Newer findings seem to highlight a clear mechanism for prejudice on the political left as well. Can you elaborate on that?
Correct. That's a really important point to bring in. The newest findings confirm that liberals absolutely can and do exhibit prejudice as well. And crucially, the underlying root cause appears to be exactly the same for both sides. It boils down to perceived value conflict.
Okay, so the prejudice just flows outward based on who is perceived to be the primary ideological threat to one's own core values, regardless of whether those core values are based more on security and tradition or more on equality and progress.
Exactly. The target groups simply shift, depending on whose values are perceived as the biggest threat to one's own core ideological principles and vision for society. So, for example, the research might show conservatives perceiving groups like liberals, atheists, or perhaps gay people as holding values that fundamentally threaten their preferred traditional order-based worldview. Conversely, the same research might show liberals perceiving groups such as conservatives, maybe large corporations or business people, or religious fundamentalists as holding values often related perhaps to social dominance, economic inequality, or perceived intolerance that fundamentally threaten their core progressive ideals of equality, fairness, and social justice.
So the end result is a kind of ideological polarization, where prejudice flows strongly toward the groups perceived as posing the greatest threat to one's own core moral mission or worldview. It's really the value difference hypothesis playing out vividly in modern political conflict.
Precisely. The perceived threat to values is the engine, regardless of the specific content of those values.
Okay, so we've established these durable structural components, core values, and overarching social ideologies. But prejudice often operates on a much faster, much more visceral level day to day, doesn't it? And that's where emotion comes in. Emotion seems like the engine that drives our immediate reactions, like avoidance or aggression.
Emotion is absolutely critical, yes. And it has two defining characteristics that are really important for our discussion of prejudice. First, emotions are often aroused automatically, frequently below the level of conscious awareness. You feel the tension, the unease, the anger, or the pity before you even fully rationalize why. Second, emotions actively motivate behavior. They push us to act, either facilitating the application of a negative stereotype and leading to discrimination, or conversely, sometimes inhibiting prejudice. And it's really crucial to note here, as the sources emphasize, that one particular emotion, empathy, is consistently shown across studies to act as a powerful brake on prejudice. It tends to reduce bias by fostering connection.
Now, to understand why different outgroups seem to elicit such different specific types of prejudice, why some groups might make us feel pity, while others make us feel contempt, or even envy, we need to turn to a really useful framework called the stereotype content model, or SCM.
Yes, the SCM is quite elegant, really, because it argues that our stereotypes about different groups, across cultures even, tend to reflect our perceptions of them along just two primary fundamental dimensions. The first dimension is warmth. This is about how friendly, trustworthy, sincere, or non-competitive a group is perceived to be. Are they on our side? The second dimension is competence. This is about how able, skilled, intelligent, efficient, or successful a group is perceived to be. Can they enact their intentions? And mapping groups onto this 2x2 matrix high-low warmth crossed with high-low competence generates four predictable quadrants, and each quadrant tends to elicit a unique, specific emotional and behavioral response. Hashtag 5.2, the stereotype content model, SCM.
Okay, let's walk through those four emotional quadrants, using the examples provided in the sources. Let's start with the group that seems to receive the most positive outcome in this matrix.
Right, that would be the high warmth plus high competence quadrant. The research often uses examples like middle-class people or maybe close allies or just the core members of one's own in-group here. These groups are viewed positively on both dimensions. They're seen as trustworthy and friendly, high warmth, and also capable and successful, high competence. The emotions elicited here are pretty straightforward. Admiration, respect, maybe pride if it's the in-group. The behavioral tendency is active facilitation helping them, cooperating with them. They're seen as psychological partners.
Okay, makes sense. Moving to the next quadrant. High warmth but low competence. The examples given here are often groups like people with significant mental or physical disabilities, or perhaps the very elderly.
Yes, so these groups are generally not perceived as a competitive threat. They're seen as friendly or harmless, high warmth, but they are simultaneously seen as incapable of fully contributing, competing effectively, or maybe managing their own affairs, low competence. This specific combination tends to elicit a mix of emotions, primarily pity, perhaps sympathy, but sometimes tinged with disrespect or infantilization. The behavioral tendency here is often passive help, giving charity but not necessarily empowering them, or sometimes just neglect.
Okay, then we hit the more negative quadrants. Let's start with the one that is often perceived as particularly dangerous: low warmth but high competence. The research examples here sometimes include groups like historically Jewish people or Asian people in certain contexts, or maybe the rich.
Right. This quadrant produces arguably the most dangerous emotional cocktail, socially speaking. It tends to generate complex, often ambivalent, but highly negative emotions. Things like active fear, deep hostility, resentment, and particularly corrosive envy. These groups are perceived as highly capable, intelligent, and powerful, high competence, making them formidable competitors or potential threats. But crucially, they're also seen as fundamentally untrustworthy, cold, or antagonistic to the in-group's interests, low warmth. The high competence means they are seen as having the actual power to challenge, exploit, or undermine the in-group. This volatile blend often leads to a desire to covertly undermine them, discriminate against them, or in extreme cases, actively attack them.
Wow. Okay, and finally, the quadrant that seems to generate the most potent and maybe toxic negative emotion, often leading to complete avoidance or dehumanization: low warmth and low competence. Examples here might include welfare recipients or homeless people, according to some studies.
Yes, this quadrant typically elicits pure, unadulterated contempt and disgust. These groups are viewed negatively on both dimensions, seen as untrustworthy or lazy, low warmth, and as incapable or burdensome, low competence. They are often perceived as both worthless and perhaps undeserving of help or attention. The low warmth and low competence combination tends to generate an extreme sense of avoidance and exclusion. The emotional response is often characterized by moral exclusion. They might be literally viewed as less than human, undeserving of basic consideration, and are often ignored, segregated, or actively pushed out of the social field. It's a very dehumanizing response. Hashtag 5.3 individual differences in emotional sensitivity. It's clear that not everyone reacts to these group placements or these quadrants with exactly the same emotional intensity. The sources also talk about individual differences in emotional sensitivity, and they use disgust as a prime example of how this can lead to a more targeted prejudicial response. That's right. Disgust is a particularly interesting emotion in this context because it's evolutionarily linked to avoiding contamination and disease. But it's also strongly linked psychologically to perceived value threat and the fear of moral contamination. The research shows that people who score high on general sensitivity to disgust, people who are just more easily disgusted by things in general, tend to report more negative attitudes, specifically toward groups that they perceive as threatening their moral or traditional values. For example, groups perceived to violate established sexual norms or religious codes or purity standards. But importantly, these high disgust sensitivity individuals don't necessarily show increased prejudice toward other outgroups that don't happen to violate those specific moral or purity values.
So the disgust response isn't general prejudice, it's highly targeted.
Exactly. Disgust seems to function as a highly targeted emotional response that facilitates moral condemnation and boundary enforcement against specific groups perceived as unclean or immoral, according to one's value system. Hashtag 5.4 intergroup anxiety and avoidance.
Okay, another absolutely crucial emotional response, maybe less intense than disgust, but incredibly powerful in shaping our social world, is intergroup anxiety. This is that feeling of discomfort, unease, or awkwardness that people often experience when they're interacting or even just anticipating interacting with members of other groups, especially unfamiliar ones.
Yes, intergroup anxiety is incredibly common, and it's fueled by a potent set of expected negative consequences. This isn't just mild awkwardness for many people. It can be genuine psychological fear or stress. Those negative expectations can include several things: a fear that the outgroup members will reject or judge the person negatively, maybe a fear that the person's own in-group members will ridicule or criticize them for associating with the outgroup. Why are you hanging out with them? The very real possibility of embarrassment from accidentally committing a social blunder due to cultural misunderstanding, or simply the acute concern about inadvertently appearing prejudiced, saying the wrong thing.
That seems to perfectly explain why people often just avoid difference altogether, doesn't it? Even if they don't consciously harbor deep hatred or strong negative stereotypes, it's just easier, less stressful to stay within familiar territory.
That's often the primary consequence, yes.
Hmm.
Avoidance. And sometimes that avoidance gets paired with a kind of low-level hostility toward the outgroup, almost as a preemptive defense mechanism to justify the avoidance. Anxiety fundamentally motivates people to avoid difference and seek similarity. Why? Because similarity keeps life feeling simple, it promotes psychological safety and predictability, and it reinforces feelings of normality. It's often the psychological path of least resistance when facing the uncertainty of interacting across group lines.
But can this anxiety be successfully mitigated? Can we make those interactions less stressful in social settings?
Yes, absolutely. The research suggests that intergroup anxiety is significantly reduced in highly structured situations.
What do you mean by structured?
Environments where there are clear, predefined rules for behavior. Think about maybe a formal ceremony, a structured debate, a specific workplace training session with clear guidelines, or even just a task-focused interaction where everyone knows their role. When behavior is governed by clear external rules and expectations, the possibility of making an embarrassing social blunder or appearing prejudiced is significantly reduced. This lessens the anticipation of those negative consequences and therefore tends to lower the intergroup anxiety. Structure provides a sense of safety and predictability. Hashtag 5.5, the power of empathy.
Okay, finally, let's end this section on emotion by revisiting the potential antidote, the emotional response that seems to work in the opposite direction. Empathy. The sources consistently highlight empathy as a key mechanism for actually reducing prejudice.
Yes, empathy is crucial here. It's generally defined as an other-centered emotional response feelings like sympathy, compassion, tenderness, concern that is congruent with another person's perceived welfare. You feel for them. And the sources really stress that perspective taking, the cognitive act of actively trying to adopt the other person's psychological viewpoint, to see the world through their eyes, is an especially important component or pathway to generating that empathetic feeling.
And how does that cognitive and emotional shift, taking their perspective, feeling empathy, actually translate into a measurable reduction of prejudice? What's the mechanism?
Well, the research consistently shows that people who score higher on dispositional empathy, or people who are experimentally induced to feel empathy, tend to show less prejudice, both the explicit kind they report and even the implicit automatic kind measured in labs. This seems to happen primarily because empathy induces powerful feelings of similarity and connection with members of other groups. If you can successfully bridge that psychological gap, if you can genuinely imagine their experiences and feelings, you start to associate your positive views of yourself, your core in-group feelings of warmth and connection with that out-group person or the group as a whole. This connection directly undermines the psychological basis for derogation and bias. It essentially makes them part of your expanded circle of concern, making it much harder to maintain negative stereotypes or hostile feelings towards them. Empathy breaks down the US versus them wall. Hashtag utter war.
Wow. Okay, we have definitely covered some extensive ground today in this deep dive. We've really traced the psychological ingredients of bias all the way from those internal conflicts of individual values, that fundamental tension between individualism and the protective safety net of egalitarianism. And we saw how our deep, perhaps unconscious, need for meaning in the face of mortality drives the powerful defense mechanisms described by terror management theory.
Yeah, and then we explored those more rigid structures of social ideologies, right-wing authoritarianism, driven by that search for security through obedience and conventionalism, clashing with perceived threats, and social dominance orientation, demanding group superiority and using those often insidious legitimizing myths to justify a fixed social inequality.
And finally, we synthesized the immediate visceral response of emotion. We saw how the stereotype content model maps groups onto that warmth competence grid, generating such specific targeted feelings like contempt, pity, envy, or admiration, and how intergroup anxiety fuels avoidance, while, crucially, empathy offers a powerful, constructive path toward tolerance and genuine connection.
Our mission today was really to synthesize these key psychological ingredients of prejudice, pulling from the source material. And I think what we've clearly established is that prejudice, at its psychological root, is rarely about simple random dislike. It seems overwhelmingly to be about perceived threat, whether that's a threat to one's core values, a threat to one's sense of security and order like an RWA, or a threat to one's group dominance and position in the hierarchy like an SDO. It's threat perception driving the response.
Which leaves us, and you, with this final provocative thought to consider, something to maybe mull over based on everything we've discussed. Given that the sources clearly demonstrate that bipartisan prejudice flowing from both political left and right appears deeply rooted in these fundamental perceived value conflicts, where both sides increasingly view the other's core beliefs, whether those focus on equality or on tradition, as an existential threat to society itself. What does this tell us about the profound difficulty of achieving and maintaining a truly shared, functional society in our current climate? Is identifying the precise value conflict, as we've tried to do today by unpacking the psychology, merely the key to understanding the depth of the problem? Or could it possibly be the necessary, perhaps painful, first step toward finding any kind of sustainable resolution?